One of the problems, one of the unspoken problems came from within my own occupation. Journalism and media is much talked about now. It's probably the most popular subject. 25 years ago, it was almost never talked about. And journalists themselves were often very defensive, and still are. And yet it's absolutely critical, not just journalism, but the whole question of media, of information. I think when I say it dawned on me, one of the dawnings was when I was making a film undercover in Czechoslovakia during the Stalinist time there. This was in the late 1970s. And I interviewed a very brave man called Urbanik, who was a novelist. And he was effectively under house arrest, put there by the regime. He'd spoken out. He was one of a group called Charter 77, you may remember. Very brave people who decided to speak out within this totalitarian situation and wanted to be interviewed. So Urbanik, he said, I sometimes feel sorry for you people over in the West because, whereas here we know our media lies to us. Every time we turn on the television, we know it's a pack of lies. Every time we pick up a newspaper, we know we're reading lies and deceptions. But you people, so indeed we've had to, in order to combat this, we've had to learn to read between the lines. And so you had, right throughout Eastern Europe, flourishing underground theatre, samizdat journalism, that challenged it. And the same was true in the Soviet Union. I interviewed the deputy editor of Pravda during the late 1970s, and he laughed at that Pravda, which means truth, would be telling people the truth. I mean, it was a sort of the kind of laughter between journalists, but it was a very important expression of cynicism, because even he didn't believe that his readers believed it. Now, here I think we've travelled quite a way over the last 10, 20 years in challenging the media, in challenging what we're told. When I say challenging the media, I mean challenging those in authority, those in politics, those with vested interests, those who aren't accountable almost every day of their lives. And in my view, that's what authority should be in a democracy, accountable all the time. And that applies to very, very few people in our so-called democracies. So the media serves, in its so-called mainstream sense, as a cipher for much of this. And I think that the challenge has begun, but it's only just begun, because we live with this myth that we live in an information society, especially now the digital age has happened, and when in fact we live in a media society. They're very different.
And are things, in your view, so we've started to challenge the media, is what you're saying. So does that mean that things are getting better, or is it just that we're beginning to realise that there is a problem?
The monoliths of power are monoliths. And I think, the bit of Martha Gellhorn's quote about we don't win, but we don't quite lose either. And when you challenge monoliths, you can't expect change as such, although it can be at times. It can be dramatic. The point is, it hasn't been tried for a long time. An example, during the Scottish referendum, there were very, very live demonstrations of people, articulate, incensed people in many ways, and rightly so, around the BBC in Scotland, the way it reported it. Now, I think that had a very considerable effect on people who work for the BBC in Scotland. It wouldn't have changed a BBC agenda. That's sort of like changing the church, you know. I mean, it's a pillar of state, but beginning to recognise the BBC as a pillar of state, not as it likes to present itself, as an objective and impartial body, and without denigrating the good work that so much of the BBC does, though I would not put that news and current affairs as part of that. In other words, recognising that as an extension of the state, not as something that you turn on and believe, has begun to happen. That's really important. That applies here. It applies in every parliamentary democracy.
I mean, it's an interesting example to use the BBC because it makes it very clear from the beginning that you're not talking necessarily about corporate interests in the media, even though that's obviously very significant too. The BBC makes a lot, as I'm sure RTE would hear, of its role as a public service broadcaster. But you're talking about an institution that has become an institution, a pillar of the state and an agent of the state in some form. But so what sets the agenda then? Where does the drive to set the agenda that you're talking about come from, in your view?
Well, no one sits down and sets the agenda. The agenda is an insidious force. And state and corporate are so together now. You find on the BBC, you'll find more, I would say, outright raw corporate propaganda than you might in commercial. Now, you know, I declare I make my documentaries are shown by the ITV network, which is the biggest commercial network in Europe. It's commercial. They make some really commercial programs, to say the least. It's run by advertising. And I've only worked briefly for the BBC. Right throughout my career, I've regarded the BBC as an intensely political organisation that reflected the state in the way it saw itself at a particular time, the way it perceived the threats to it, and so on. So it's very interesting that although it's a state broadcaster that's intended to be a public service broadcaster, it's in fact a corporate broadcaster. And that debate hasn't even really begun seriously in the UK about the BBC. It's beginning, as I mentioned, the Scottish referendum, that was all about a state bias, a London bias, about presenting Scotland in a rather patronising way, you know?
It's interesting for many of us who in our day jobs might engage with me. Challenges is very often, well, first of all, I'll profess a certain sympathy at times when we're engaging with the media from an Amnesty perspective and we're trying to get them to pay attention to an issue that we believe is pressing and current, because I think it's fair to say that increasingly the resources that are available to newsrooms and news desks are limited and limiting, and therefore their ability to engage proactively with a story or with an issue can be challenging. But you're saying more than that, I think, that there's an earlier filter that's, as you said, insidious, that's a reflection of power within that particular state or group of states that begins to filter and tell stories from a particular perspective.
I think when people walk through the doors of a great institution, okay, we're on the BBC at the moment, but there are others in the United States, the great networks, CBS, NBC, and so on. When they walk through the doors of an institution that sees itself as central to upholding the values of the state, whether they like it or not, they take on they internalize is the word, I suppose, all the ideas and architecture within that. I mean, the received wisdom is that once you enter the BBC, then you rise to some nirvana of impartiality and objectivity, and that everything you speak to is the truth. People believe that. Really good journalists actually believe that, and it's total rubbish. You know, it is taking on the language, a particular language and vocabulary. It is exercising the most insidious and possibly virulent form of censorship, that is by omission, leaving out. People you see on evening programs, the morning radio programs, are people drawn from a certain power class. And, okay, moving on from the abstract, I mean, we had the most vivid example of where this went so wrong was the invasion of Iraq. The BBC, as a number of studies, particularly media monitors and the University at Cardiff and so on, found in their academic way that it had simply, all of us knew this anyway, it had reflected the government. In other words, it had beat the drums of war, which all of the media did during that run-up, particularly in 2002, so where the point where Bush and Blair sent in their armies and triggered something that caused the deaths by any scholarly measure of some 700,000 people. I don't think people, certainly in the UK, still understand the scale of the consequence of that action, in which the media played an absolutely critical role, such a critical role that when I asked a number of my colleagues, distinguished people, Dan Rather in the United States, Charles Lewis of 60 Minutes, top mainstream journalists to reflect on this, it was interesting to hear them. They said that had the media, that's the American media, the really powerful media, and yet constitutionally the freest media in the world, had it done its job, had it not amplified all these deceptions, had it challenged them, had it asked questions, then that invasion may not have happened. I'm not sure about that, but that was their view. So that's probably the most vivid example I can think of as the way we, as journalists, are integrated into a system and play a part, not of informing you people, but playing a part as drumbeaters, if you like.
And where do you see that same dynamic playing out now? Where has that developed to, for instance? I mean, there's a lot of, I should be a bit clear about what I mean. I don't necessarily want us to talk only about the Middle East.
No,
because there's a kind of a narrative that focuses on the Middle East as if the Middle East is the problem, and you're kind of picking it up at a line.
It is touching practically all our lives, isn't it? And it's given governments, Western governments, their reason to start paring back our freedoms right across the world, from Australia to the UK, certainly to the United States. You don't see a policeman, half a dozen people turn up for a demonstration and the policemen don't attend, robo-cops attend. I mean, the Middle East has had a huge effect because it is the most colonized, permanently colonized part of the world. And what we're seeing at the moment is the greatest turmoil in the Middle East since the end of the Ottoman Empire, no question. Anyway, I'm sorry. I just suppose it's a bit hard to...
No, I'm not suggesting that we avoid it at all. I think it's really important that we do. Yeah. But what I'm fascinated about how you approach... it would be very easy for us to spend a couple of hours, and by the way, we're not going to just spend a couple of hours talking at each other. We'll be bringing you in as soon as we possibly can as well to open up this conversation. But I just meant that it would be very easy and engaging for us to talk about the Middle East for a couple of hours. But actually, when I've heard you talk about it, you've wanted to lift it up beyond just a focus on the Middle East as a problem to looking at this in a much more global context and understanding the dynamics that have led to conflict there and the fallout from that conflict that we've seen, but also how that's, as you've just mentioned, impacted upon rights and freedoms and public expression at the global level. So the kind of restrictions that have been placed in law right across the world, the rollback, for instance, that's happened on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, on simple rights and freedoms. I mean, the very fact that the countries that were the big champions of the prohibition against torture became the most prolific torturers globally and became those who justified torture. That's part of the fallout from all of this, isn't it?
Yes. Well, that's regression. That's regression. We have gone through a period of unrelenting regression. And where I'm thinking when I started in Fleet Street, how newspapers and other media were open to another view of the world. And so I suppose reflected much of the considerable hope that was in the world. I'm talking about the 60s then, 60s and 70s, even though there was a lot of turmoil, of course, and a vicious war, one particularly vicious war going on. But they were open to it. That is virtually closed down in many, unless you've been around for quite a while, like I have, and you know how to fight your corner. You know how to navigate through the system. You know how to keep going. But for young people, starting out with all the idealism, and I have a lot to do with young journalists, with all the idealism that they have, it's very, very difficult for them because there has been a real regression. Yeah. And it is, I think you're right to suggest we look at it in a wider sense. I mean, for people to turn on the television, the radio, is litany of horror, of disaster. How can they? I mean, when I've been cutting a documentary, I've had quite long conversations, gone over a day, about whether we should use certain material and whether certain images, whether people, that's too much, they'll recoil, it's too hard. But these days, the news is that constantly, because there's no attempt to make sense of it. It's, whoopee, here's another war. Whoopee, we got beheading images. Now, that may sound black, but that's what it comes down to. Whoopee, here's the slaughter of this, or there's this disaster, the school shooting, and so on. There's no attempt to contextualize this. I can't understand why anybody actually turns on the news and watches it. I don't. If I'm monitoring it or deconstructing it, yes. But it's just not an option to get information.
So no context or analysis, just a sensational.
No, we have war journalism, and I've reported quite a few wars, so I understand about war journalism, but we don't have peace journalism. And I don't mean that in that it's given over to a peace group, but the whole idea that places of conflict should be reported, let's say, in terms of law. Two things: law and, dare I say it, a moral issue, the right and wrong, but law. Back to the Middle East briefly, if you reported Palestine in terms of the law, that is, laws brought in by those who are the major players, as you pointed out just a bit ago, in that part of the world, you would have a completely different front page. You'd have a completely different news section because you'd be looking at it completely differently.
What would that look like in your view? What difference would that make?
Well, it would make all the difference. It would mean in Palestine that the struggle of the Palestinians against the world's longest military occupation would be presented as that. United Nations and the International Court of Justice and all the jurists on earth have said so. And most of us, when that is presented to us as a clear case of injustice, miscarriage, wrong, will accept that. We accept that in our personal lives, but we're not given that as news, where countries and situations like Palestine are reported through the prism of our own power, which is represented as benign. It's almost, you know, as I've observed it, countries are regarded by, say, the Foreign Office in London or the State Department in Washington in terms of their usefulness or their expendability. It's a very, de Gaulle had it right about power. It's a very, very cynical way of looking at the world, but that's the way power works. We don't work, individuals don't work that way. We're far more open to understanding human injustice. And so reporting Palestine in terms of justice, well, you wouldn't have, as Professor Greg Philo and these people at Glasgow University have done all these extraordinary reports on the reporting of Palestine over the years. One of their reports found that in the UK, only 9% of young viewers of television news understood that the occupying power was Israel. They thought it was Palestine. That understood that the so-called settlers, another acceptable term, were Israelis or brought in by Israel. They thought they were Palestinians. But words used like atrocity and injustice and so on were used in terms against the Palestinians, never in a positive sense for them. So, you know, whether you are for them or against them, that's a fact. So the fact they found was the more you watched, the less you knew. And that would be the way I would suggest it works out too.
You're putting me in a very interesting position now, because I almost have to present the counter-argument, which I don't hold.
Just when you're being a devil's advocate, just
exactly.
Think about what the devil, he's a worry.
I'm going to ask you a question that I suspect I already know the answer to, but of course, that would be to journalists who would adopt that position in terms of how they report would be that it's for them to present a balanced, objective view of a situation and not to take either side or a position on either side.
No, it's not. And that presents, you've just read out the BBC Real Book.
I know.
And there are not two sides. There's an attempt to get the truth, an attempt to get the facts.
Yeah.
Truth and facts, you know, God knows what truth is, but truth does exist, and facts certainly do exist, and evidence exists. Our court system depends on evidence. You know, it doesn't take two sides. You know, like there's the victim and there's the perpetrator. Oh, we've got to be impartial here, says the judge. It's ridiculous.
Well, particularly now I'm going to betray my objectivity completely, or my so-called my pretend objectivity on this one. I mean, we certainly wouldn't have a situation where post a finding of a court, we still allowed either side to present their position as if there hadn't been a finding.
Yes.
So, and in the context of what
That's
you're talking about, I
important.
think this is your crucial point,
Well,
isn't it?
absolutely. I mean, I won't make a film unless it is probably the major witnesses are the other side. Because as long as they're properly interrogated and freely give of their views, you'll understand more about a situation by interrogating that side. But when do you hear the people in authority, political figures? Yes, they're interrogated about personality and about certain issues, perhaps, but there's more bluster in the interrogation, I feel.
And also in certain debates or discussions, and I mean the Israeli-Palestine situation is a perfect example of it, we seem to allow people to try to somehow interpret law as if in a way that simply isn't accurate or correct. So, for instance, on the question of occupation or on the question of what constitutes a war crime, you'll often hear Israeli government representatives, or I mean, I've had these conversations with the Israeli government myself, toss about points that are well established in law, about what's permissible in conflict, about what is a war crime. I mean, we have the Geneva Conventions, we have international humanitarian law and human rights law, and yet somehow media and political discussion seems to allow those who are responsible for violations of the law to protest that they aren't, and for that to go unchallenged.
They're very good at media. They're very good at media, and controlling media, if you look at some of the documents leaked by WikiLeaks, I mean, there's a great one. It almost runs to 1,000 pages. It's actually got a subheading, How to Stop Leaks, and it was leaked. And it says that media management, uses the term media management and media control, are more important. This is General Petraeus, who ran the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan for long. He said that more effort should be put into managing the media rather than managing, so-called, the enemy. And he was referring to the Taliban there. He was saying it was more important, the media. So the perception was more important. Anyway, this particular document had the greatest threats to civilization, as the Ministry of Defence in London interpreted civilization. There were three main ones. The Russian spies were number 3. Terrorists were number 2, and number 1 were investigative journalists. Which is terribly encouraging, you know. I mean, it means that if you do your job, and we haven't spoken here, it sounds like I'm down on all my colleagues, and I'm not. If you do your job, then you represent the best kind of threat. And the honourable exceptions are those who do this. They're often mavericks, but they're people who do believe in the whole question of facts and truth and information and so on. And the moment I hear somebody, particularly in television, start talking about two sides, that means in Cambodia, I should have found Pol Pot and said, "Look, Mr. Pot, why did you kill almost 2 million people? We've got to hear your side of it." It's just absurd. It is about finding out. It is about finding as much truth as you can. It's quite a modest ambition, because you can't find the whole truth. There are multiple sides, but you can truthfully try and find out. That's how I would define it. actually.
And how do you go about that in a world where so much information is withheld, controlled, filtered?
You go to the bottom. Everything, as I mentioned, with all these people writing their multiple studies, the Pentagon spent $4.5 billion, I read, on media management over 3 or 4 years. So you don't go to the top unless you go to present your evidence to the top. That's when you do it. You go to the bottom. You quoted Martha Gellhorn there. She used to say, you look through the telescope, not from the top, but up. And Robert Fisk and I had a few years ago, we were in New York, and we decided to have an experiment. We went through the New York Times on this particular day, and we reckon that something like 80% of the major stories in this great paper of record in the United States, all the news that fits to print, says the masthead, came from authority in some form. Came from government, came from vested interest, came from authority. And it's authority that is believed. People below authority are not believed, but that's where you find the truth. I've always found in reporting wars that you will find enough of the truth from the victims of wars, rarely from their perpetrators.
And it's fascinating to reflect on the fact that Petraeus, for instance, felt that managing the media was more important than almost managing the enemy. And so that suggests that media management is a priority because power is frightened of what? Or what's it concerned about? I mean, if that much management and control is necessary, what's the fear?
Frightened of us. It's a wonderful thing. It's like, they're in the list of the 3. It's funny having Russian spies there, but still, terrorists, they should have popped in people. It's all directed. Why have all the liberal democracies brought in these so-called anti-terror laws? There is plenty on the statutes. The statutes are absolutely groaning with laws that allow the police and the security services to find dangerous subversive elements, those who might endanger the public. But more and more and more, there's an obsession about it. And there's a particular obsession with people finding out what the hell is going on. Government departments in London used to have press people who weren't bad, actually. They were quite erudite, they understood their subject often, and they would get information for you from within a department. That doesn't exist anymore. It's all politicized. It comes down, usually, if it's a very important issue, to one central source. And they will give you the line, which you then have to deconstruct, certainly not believe.
And it's a line rather than communication of fact or response to that you've looked at.
It's a line.
That word terrorist is an interesting one, isn't it?
Well, it's a nonsense word. What is it? What's it mean? It's been used in so many... It's meant to frighten us, and there is such a thing as terror. But what is a terrorist? Is it? Yes, it is certainly somebody who does some of these ghastly things we've seen lately on YouTube. That's certainly a terrorist. But a terrorist is also somebody who knowingly drops high explosives on, as I've seen, on stone and mud and straw houses in Afghanistan and wipe out entire families with a 500-pound bomb. Terrorists are also those who litter died with cluster bombs, which children pick up, or litter whole areas with toxic weaponry, such as depleted uranium. That's terrorism as well. It's a word that doesn't take us anywhere, because we have to, there again, we come back to whether something is right or wrong. So it cries out for people not to hide behind this lazy term, terrorism, but say what it is. And if you're going to say what it is, let's have both sides.
And who will adjudicate that then? So who's going to adjudicate what's right or wrong?
Well, you can't adjudicate what's right or wrong. Right and wrong is a pretty strong impulse right throughout people. That's been my experience. And I would have thought, let's say, the Palestinians, having endured this disgusting situation in their own country, that's wrong. In a word, it's wrong. And if we want to show how one-eyed we are, then we're invited to express our horror at a barbaric manifestation of this Islamist movement, this ISIS in the Middle East, about which something must be done. Planes go in, Cameron, even Abbott far away in Australia sends his planes in. We're in, we must do it. But nothing was done about Gaza. Do you know, I read today that the reconstruction of Gaza, 100,000 homes were killed, putting aside all the lives that have been absolutely destroyed, and I'm talking about those who are still living. But all the reconstruction, and something like $4 billion has been promised. Much of it won't be given, I think, as you know, from Amnesty's point of view, it's always the promise. Every sack of cement, every piece of reconstruction material has to be approved by the Israelis. Has to be approved by those who did it. You know, that is wrong.
Well, I mean, the tolerance of any state, and in this case Israel's, violation of so many different tenets or aspects of international law is frankly extraordinary. I think you're absolutely spot on about that. I mean, the fact that, you'll have heard this, and we'll have all have heard this in the context of that particular conflict, of that particular dynamic. I remember having somebody from the Israeli government once say to me that they attached a different moral value to a Palestinian life lost in an Israeli reprisal for a rocket attack launch from Palestine, a civilian life, attached to an Israeli civilian life lost as a result of that.
Well,
so a different moral value.
That's demonstrated. They're in their own secret and archive documentation. They have various words, and they're not all that different from Untermenschen, subhuman, as the Nazis.
Well, again, I've heard the suggestion in response to the occupation. I remember again, and I can say all of this because these were things that Israel also said publicly. So it's not just that they were in individual conversations, but having a conversation in about 2009, 2010 about the occupation and the impact of it on the population of Gaza. Remember, here we're talking about a population of about 1.7, 1.8 million people in a territory. To put this in an Irish context, it's half the size of County Tipperary. And a population that cannot leave. So it's stuck there, it cannot leave. And talking about what we described and many others described at the time of the humanitarian crisis that was resulting from the blockade. The notion that this was a humanitarian crisis was rejected, but the Israeli government asserted to us that conditions in Gaza are very difficult and they must stay that way in order for Israel to be safe. So a tacit acknowledgement of collective punishment. Of a collective punishment of 1.7, 1.8 million people, half of whom are under 18, for instance. I think about 50% of the population of Gaza is under 18. And I'm using, because we've talked about Israel, I'm using Israel as an example, but that kind of egregious assertion of a determined conscious, deliberate breach of international law that carried with it no consequence.
Then the question is, why is it accepted?
So why is it accepted?
Well, it's accepted because we and that's us, allow great power to do what it wants to do, to be rapacious, to run things. We don't teach our children, I don't believe, teach our students, our journalists, to understand. It's impossible to understand how the world works unless you understand how the imperial world worked. And that should be a presence in this room, in this country, how the imperial world worked, however long ago, it doesn't matter. Because what we're seeing across the world, not entirely, but mostly, is a mayhem that has come out of this violent ordering of the world. I mentioned earlier, the Middle East is at its most probably catastrophic since the end of the Ottoman Empire. That's the beginning of the 20th century. We need a frame to understand that. And we need, at the very least, to object to an anti-history movement which runs through so much of our understanding. And I've talked about the media here. The media, almost by definition, is ephemeral in many ways, but our teaching shouldn't be. Our appreciation of the world shouldn't be. And it's so I suppose an answer to your question, Colm, is another way of understanding it. It is contextualizing everything. Understanding that we have a world of technological splendor, almost. Incredible. But we have a world also in which there are worthy victims and unworthy victims. Edward Herman's great and then we have a separate category of unpeople. But worthy and unworthy victims. I always thought it was at its most explicable and absurd when you took the Kurds. The Kurds in Iraq were worthy victims. They were good Kurds. The Kurds across the border in Turkey, who were hunted down by the Turkish government, were bad Kurds. They were unworthy victims. Now, that's not all that difficult to work out, but that applies right across the world. And it is wrenching our way of looking at the world away from looking through the eyes of great power, of looking at it independently. I think that's what we do about it.
Yeah. Of course, it's also true to say that education in the developed world context is something that, well, first of all, the obligation to educate rests with the state, which is something that we would say. But there's a problem then there, isn't there? Because if it's the state that's educating, it's going to be through the lens of the state in some form. Now, I'm not, by the way, I should be very, very careful. I'll go into the office tomorrow and get slapped around for suggesting that somehow the state might not necessarily have to have that obligation. Clearly it does. But how do we make sure that education is objective? For those of us growing up in this country, for instance, for most of our modern history, we had a very biased interpretation of our own history.
It was a power. It was what we've taught. It was an imperial history.
Yeah, exactly. Or or a version of
a
imperialism.
version of it.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up with in Australia with two groups of humanity completely banished. The first were women, and the second were the indigenous people of the country in which I was born. And the great histories, the great epic histories of exploration and settlement and so on, virtually included those. And so you had, and it was only later that the extraordinary diaries of women who were pioneer women were published, and great writers in Australia, female writers like Christina Stead and others, produced their work, that you realise that the role that, of course, 50% of the country had played, but the books excluded entirely those who had been attacked by the imperial invaders of their country. And that was the indigenous people. So, but I have to say that I find, and you know, I have two grown-up children, and I had a lot to do with, both were state educated in the UK. I must have met some of the most brilliantly subversive teachers. And I so admire teachers, those who are against the weight of bureaucracy, telling them to change all the time, or this new management layer over them, trying to turn them into corporate beings. And yet they don't get away with it. I find that one of the most hopeful sides, that I'm sure it's true here, certainly in the UK, certainly in the US, certainly in Australia. Great swathes of the teaching profession teach because it's a vocation to them, and they believe that children have a right to be allowed to make sense of the world.
I've just written down that two words, worthy and unworthy, because it seems to me that perhaps you're offering a way in which we can apply a lens to what power says to us. So if we look again back to the Middle East, because it's the place where we see the greatest conflict, if we look to the justifications for intervention, they're often made in the name of the people of those societies. So we're interfering because of the risk to the population of the country that those in power in that country pose. Yeah. So suddenly we're seeing the population as worthy of our intervention. And yet when we look at the fallout of that intervention, if we look, for instance, at the refugee crisis, that's come from the conflict in Syria, Libya and other places, at that moment they're entirely unworthy of intervention. I'm struck by the fact, for instance, that the UK government today said that it won't pledge a penny towards the cost of search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean. The EU has now taken over responsibility for search and rescue, because they've said that they don't want to create an invitation to people to access protection in Europe. So suddenly these people whose existence justified intervention, they're now unworthy of any intervention that might actually save them from, 20,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean trying to access protection in Europe. And we're not talking about, in that context as well, remember, we're not talking about a gift of protection. The EU and EU member states have obligations, again, international legal obligations, to offer protection to those who need it. So it's back perhaps to an interesting lens that we could apply when media or when politicians or governments portray a group of people who are vulnerable or in desperate circumstances that are either worthy or unworthy, that perhaps that's the moment when we need to question the justification or the grounds for that.
Well, you know, the skillful use of propaganda, news propaganda, can make scapegoats of people very easily. You know, the 20,000 can be made scapegoats of. In Australia, they go the extra mile, and they sell off refugees. They've just sold a whole lot to Cambodia with a bribe of about $30-40 million. They imprison them on dreadful islands off the coast of.
For the ones who are, as I understand it, that's for those who are granted.
Yeah.
Who are recognised as being worthy of asylum or entitled to asylum or protection. They're then not allowed into Australia. They're shipped off to one of the.
And these are people who are often fleeing wars that Australia itself, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. So they do that because they think it's politically wise to do so. It will get them elected again. And there's some truth to back that. because people have been scapegoated massively. Isn't that something in an open society that we scapegoat refugees because we're worried about our own situation? We can have all our own fears exploited very easily. But that headline can just pass today that the British government has decided to end search and rescue.
Or not to contribute a penny.
Not to contribute a penny to
cost,
it. You know.
And these things are then not understood or not challenged, and this is back to, again, how media might challenge. I've no sense at all, I haven't seen anything yet anyway, of the media challenged in the UK on the basis that it has a legal obligation to ensure that search and rescue...
That whole question of a legal stroke moral obligation, that's verboten. That's not part of the two sides. That's not part of the objectivity. That legal moral obligation. Even the question. Not once was Blair ever challenged. Yes, he gave the odd interview in which there was some bluster and that sort of thing. But not once was he challenged on the legal, moral question of that. Before, during, and after. That's quite something.
And there has been no accountability ever since.
No.
A question for you then. I was struck recently, I read a piece that you wrote on the Ukraine and on Putin. And it's certainly something that a couple of people had mentioned to me when they knew that you were coming here to Dublin and that I'd be talking to you. Now, those of your detractors would suggest that you were eulogising Vladimir Putin. When I read the piece, I'm certainly not sure that I saw it as that. I saw it as questioning a dogma. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, I'm always rather hesitant to answer the kind of troll view of the world, eulogising. That's ridiculous. But he's been demonised for a purpose. And Ukraine is not as it has been reported. Ukraine was a push by the United States in Kiev. It's certainly, the government in Kiev was corrupt. It exhibited all the problems and nefariousness of that part of the world in its the post-Soviet period. But it was a democratic government. And that government was overthrown, as we know, it's on the record, by a fascist-led push which was funded with $5 billion by Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State. This was revealed. That in Ukraine, that fascist tradition that goes back to the UDM, this army that joined the Nazis when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, has been there right through the Soviet period, repressed certainly, but since Ukraine has been independent, these far-right neo-Nazi parties have played a major role. They don't represent the whole body politic in Ukraine, but they represent a very significant part of it. In the current cabinet in Ukraine, there are something like 4 senior, including the defense minister, who are associated with it. So what we've seen in Ukraine, none of this you will read in the mainstream media, is the rise of fascism in Europe. Interestingly, not a single European leader has spoken against it. Now, if you, with all the skeptical eye, look at it from the Russian side, remembering, again, we spoke earlier of history, that Ukraine, which means borderland, was the great flat country through which the panzers drove and 22 million Soviet citizens died, And any of you who have been to Russia understands that that history is still like an extraordinary presence in that country. Now, Ukraine is a buffer state. It was the buffer state. At its best, it will be a buffer state between Europe and Russia. It was when Gorbachev agreed to withdraw all the Soviet army from East Germany, he did so with one agreement given to him in person by James Baker, the Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush, who promised that NATO would not move an inch to the east. Those were the words he used. NATO now surrounds Russia, encircles it. There's the greatest military build-up both in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet republics since the Second World War. So this is the context for it. First of all, the idea that the Russians were behind shooting down a Malaysian airliner is absurd. The idea that they've mounted a full invasion of Ukraine is absurd. And yet this use of propaganda, the idea that you suggest somebody suggested I eulogize Putin. How could I eulogize Putin? It's ridiculous. But the idea that the leader of Russia is turned into a Hitler figure, and it was Hillary Clinton who compared him with Hitler, for something, it's turning truth on its head, for something that came out of their own backyard is again absurd. It's probably even better than Palestine. I think the best example of how propaganda works in free societies. That old Russian bogey, which comes straight out of the Cold War, I grew up with it. They're bad, we're good. That's the Russian bear. Yeah. All those hideous caricatures, of course, now brought down to one man, Putin, and he runs a very, in many respects, a very nasty autocratic state. One of many across the world, including among ourselves.
Because I can understand, coming from a particular space, why some people might find what you say very troubling. But I think I also understand the general point that you're making, which is that we need to look at the broad context if we're to take a full view of a particular conflict or situation and understand where Russia might be coming from this. I understand that both from a sociological and a political perspective. But if you look at the Ukrainian government of the time and the notion that it was a democratic government, which it was, at what point then does a government lose its democratic credentials if it starts to perpetrate the kind of violence that we saw against peaceful protesters in Kiev? And there's no doubt about the fact that there were whole-scale, gross human rights violations perpetrated by the Ukrainian government in response to what was, in the main, peaceful protests. There's no question of that.
Well, they were peaceful protests until the fascist group took them over in the end, and they were no longer peaceful protests. I think turn it around always. At what point does an outside power have the right? And I'm talking about...
Or the responsibility?
And the right responsibility. At what point does the United States have the right to back a particular form of government right up against a nuclear power? At what point does to take that risk? And I think what Ukraine is the greatest risk that has been. It's not resolved by any means. We've had this so-called election, but most of eastern Ukraine has been left out. While Gaza was going on, we had no news of the assault on the eastern part of Ukraine, where whole cities were being bombarded and blasted and so on.
I mean, for the record, we've had people on the ground in eastern Ukraine, through most of this conflict. And I have colleagues at Amnesty International Ukraine who were there as well. So they were on the ground during the protests and during the police and security reaction to those protests. And from our perspective, it's very, very clear that there were gross and grave violations of human rights perpetrated by the Ukrainian government in response to those protests.
Yeah.
We also were very clear that elements of those who protested at times used violence against the police and security forces themselves, but that the response from the state was grossly disproportionate. Equally, with what's happening in eastern Ukraine now, I think we had a briefing paper out just last week, where it's very clear that, again, as you've said, propaganda is playing a very significant role in what both sides are saying about each other's conduct. What's the reality? The reality is both sides are committing war crimes, it's likely. It's clear that extrajudicial killings are a feature of the conduct of both sides. But it's also clear, for instance, that when Russia has asserted mass graves being discovered in around Donetsk, that's simply not true. We visited those sites, and that's not the case. So the propaganda is very, very clear. But you're back to the point again about needing to decode some of that.